While they're assembling, I have to confess that it's a huge honor and it's incredibly humbling to be able to moderate this panel. And I want to just give you a little bit of framing for the panel and the ways in which our panels are organized today. Each of the panels is really intentionally and explicitly organized around the concept of dialogue and conversation. This is not supposed to be a panel where there are going to be a series of papers. It's really about engaging each other and engaging you in a conversation. Now, we've got about 30 minutes for our conversation, and then we want to open it up to a broader conversation with the audience. I'm first going to do a little round of introductions, just so you know who we're talking to today. I'm going to go alphabetically. Bisi Adeleye-Fayemi is the First Lady of Ekiti State in Nigeria. She's the former director of Akina Mamawa Africa, an international development organization for African women based in London, UK. While directing AMWA, she established the African Women's Leadership Institute, AWLI, a training and networking forum for young African women, which has trained over 6,000 women across Africa, many of whom now serve in senior decision-making positions as ministers, members of parliament, academics, civil society leaders, and employees of international organizations. In 2000, Ms. Fayemi co-founded the African Women's Development Fund, the first African-wide grant-making fund, which supports the work of organizations promoting women's rights in Africa. AWDF has supported over 1,200 women's organizations in 42 African countries with over $20 million in grants. Ms. Fayemi has led multiple delegations to the United Nations concerning women's rights and gender equality and has been a resource person to UNIFEM, which is now UN Women, UN Commission on the Status of Women, UNDP, UNECA, and several other regional and international bodies. She's currently a member of the African Feminist Working Forum Working Group and on the steering committee of the Nigerian Feminist Forum. She is also one of the founders of the African Grantmakers Network, a pan-African network for African philanthropic institutions. She is also the recipient of the 2011 David Rockefeller Bridging Leadership Award, one of the most prestigious awards in the field of philanthropy. Joining us as well is Abigail Disney. Abigail Disney is a filmmaker and philanthropist. Her longtime passion for women's issues and peace building culminated in her first film, the acclaimed Pray the Devil Back to Hell, about Liberian women who peacefully ended their country's 14-year civil war. The film premiered in 2008 at the Tribeca Film Festival, where it won the honor of Best Documentary. Abigail is currently executive producer of the groundbreaking PBS miniseries Women, War, and Peace, the most comprehensive global media initiative ever mounted on the role of women in peace and conflict. She is founder of the Daphne Foundation, which works with low-income communities in the 5 boroughs of New York City, as well as Peace is Loud, which amplifies women's voices for peace building using the power of media. Her work has been recognized through numerous awards, including the prestigious International Advocate for Peace Award from the Cardozo Law School's Cardozo Journal of Conflict Resolution. Amina Mama is widely published and traveled Nigerian British feminist activist. She's a researcher and scholar who has lived and worked in Nigeria, South Africa, Britain, the Netherlands, and the US. She spent 10 years establishing and directing the University of Cape Town's African Gender Institute as a continental resource dedicated to developing transformative scholarship, bringing feminist theory and activism together. She is the founding editor of the Continental Journal of Gender Studies, Feminist Africa, and her publications include 3 books, Beyond the Mask, Race, Gender, and Subjectivity, Women's Studies and Studies of Women in Africa, and Engendering African Social Sciences. In addition, she has published numerous book chapters and journal articles. Amina is a scholar activist committed to strengthening activism and activist research in African contexts, whose research and teaching interests include culture and subjectivity, politics and policy, activist methodologies, women's movements, and militarism. She is currently professor and director of women and gender studies at the University of California, Davis. Finally, Sylvia Tamale is a Ugandan feminist lawyer and academic based in Kampala, Uganda. She was elected as the first female dean of law at Makerere University in 2004. She holds a bachelor's degree in law from Makerere University, a master's from Harvard Law School, and a PhD in sociology and feminist studies from the University of Minnesota. Professor Tamale founded and serves as coordinator of the Law, Gender, and Sexual Research Project, and was also instrumental in introducing the policy on sexual harassment at Makerere University. She has lectured at several universities, including Oxford, Cape Town, Pretoria, Wisconsin, and Zimbabwe. Sylvia has published widely on a variety of topics, including her latest book, African Sexualities, A Reader. In combining academia with activism, she adopts a critical approach to the law that aims at enhancing students' transformative personal growth and action. She has won several awards, and her work in defending the rights of marginalized groups, such as women, sexual minorities, and refugees, is legendary. Thank you. Please welcome our guests. So I have the daunting task of beginning our conversation. And I want to begin that conversation with a basic question that's sort of setting the ground for us, which is the title of this panel is Women's Rights and Transnational Feminisms. And I was hoping that each of you could briefly talk about what that concept means for you and your work. What is transnational feminism for each of you from the perspective of your work, from the perspective of your regional location? And can you share with us what the content of that is and what challenges you think face us with regard to it?
I guess it's appropriate that the Americans start because the Bisi thing is a good thing in a lot of the African women I know, but a character flaw in many cases among Americans. Mostly because as women in this country, we were raised kind of on the idea that we've done it, we've finished the work, we're all fine here, and that therefore we will fly around the world and bestow upon the women of the world our incredible knowledge, and they will learn from us and be empowered by us to go duplicate our successes in other countries. And you know, I think that is what passes for transnational feminism among American feminists. And it is, I would suggest, the primary obstacle to our capacity to actually be very constructive to promoting transnational feminism, particularly in the African context. So, you know, I spend a lot of time in those international kinds of meetings, your Clinton Global Initiative type things. I'm watching a lot of international money stampede into the space around women and women's issues. It's stampeding with the sound of a thundering herd of rhinoceros, and yet what I also know is that the women I know that work close to the ground level aren't seeing any of that money. They're not seeing any of it. It's not reaching the ground. And it's not reaching the ground precisely because when it comes to women who work at the grassroots, we are willing to offer them every resource except money. We fly them to conferences, we tell them stuff, we ask them to perform their inspirational stories for us, to tell us all about the worst thing that ever happened to them, and then we pat them on the head and ask them to sit down while we talk about the important things. So there needs to be two enormous recognitions on, at least for my part, the American side, of this equation. And if we can make these transitions, I think the money will start to flow in a way that's more constructive. And the first one is we have to recognize that in our own context, as long as we're still fighting for the idea that contraception should be made available to everyone in the country, we haven't finished the fight. We have a long way to go. We're still arguing, as Lema pointed out, about whether or not a woman can be president in this country. So we need to, first of all, look back inside and recognize that because in many ways we didn't recognize the structural problems, we didn't recognize the class, race problems that feminism in many ways unveiled, but many of us didn't have the heart or the courage to take on in a way that was structurally transformative. We haven't finished the work. And we need to do the work here at home, in our own hearts and in our own culture, before we can be very transformative for anyone else. around the world. And the second is to recognize that when you say women's issues, and then all you do is educating girls and, well, it's pretty much just educating girls, isn't it? As long as you're too afraid to tiptoe, do anything but tiptoe around the central issues of power, you're never really going to help anyone else transform their contexts. We need to stop assuming that women get too dangerous once they start to be able to have children to talk about internationally. And that means we're going to have to talk about choice and contraception and reproductive rights and freedom and the human dignities that surround those things. And if you look at where the money is stampeding to, it stampedes right up to the edge of all those things. It gets too dangerous, and everybody goes back to where it's safe, which is girls' education and everything right up until they have their periods. So I would argue that we need to stop using the word empower unless we are willing to recognize that sometimes the most important resource we have to offer women is just simply the money, and that we need to give them our resources and we need to let them do with it what they see fit, whether or not that matches our predetermined definition of what it is a feminist should be doing.
Thank you, Abigail, for kicking us off and for that little confessional. I think it's very much appreciated, and certainly by everyone on this panel. Strong women, resilience. You know what? Most women in Africa don't have any bloody choice. So the whole discourse on resilience and can we get a few more rights for women is deeply irksome. It's not to say that rights are not important, but I think we need to situate what we mean when we say women's rights. It's a liberal paradigm. All the talk about women's rights has gained currency as discourse, while the economic and political inequalities have escalated under neoliberalism. So it's all very well for us to sit and talk about women's rights, meaning giving women some of what men already have, and frankly, rights are certainly not the currency of most African men either. If we talk about political rights, if we talk about security, if we talk about the right to live free from violence, the women's rights paradigm has its origins in a history that presumes the existing systems. There was a time when we talked about liberation. There was a time when we even talked about development, a more modest agenda, meaning, you know, the standard things, education, freedom from disease, freedom. We talked about freedoms. Now we're left to talk about rights. And it reminds me of Fanon, it just comes to mind, an old discourse where leave this Europe where everybody, you could add the US, where everybody talks about rights, but wherever they go, they massacre people. Now that was in the colonial era, and I'm not saying we're still in that era, but the discourse on rights has its limitations. African women activists have expended enormous amounts of energy pursuing rights. Now the right to live free from violence, what does that mean in the context of global militarism? It's a farce. We can talk about it, but as long as we have a global system that propagates militarism, that propagates neoliberal economics, that undermines the possibility of any state or any legal system ensuring those rights, we're wasting our energy. So what I want to say is that it's perfectly justifiable and indeed justiciable to go after rights, but it's absolutely minimalist. It's a minimalist agenda, and we need to take things a lot further. So I would like to hear us talking about transformative thinking and transformative politics, even before we get to the transnational. The transnational sits in the context, a long historical context of global inequality. So what we mean by transnational can be actually almost oppositional, depending on where you're positioned and where you stand. So I think we can't really begin a conversation about transnationalism until we acknowledge the systemic differences, how our positionalities and subjectivities are configured by those different positionalities, and politics. Most of all, it's about politics and ideologies. So until we start interrogating those, we can't actually sit. It's not easy to sit across the table and look at extremely wealthy, and then very privileged myself, what business do I have? But even if Abigail and I can develop a conversation, what is the relevance of that conversation to women who are not in privileged positions? And we have different kinds of privilege. But all of this is a talk, at the moment, a conversation around, we have very powerful women here, and we're to talk about power, but we actually don't have the women at the center of the discourse present. So I just want to acknowledge that and say, okay, so let's talk about what we mean by rights and by transnationalism and whatever happened to liberation.
I think everyone in this room agrees that because we have, because patriarchy is global, and because the backlash against women's gains, women's rights gains, is global, we can begin to talk about global feminism. Not begin, we've always had global feminism. In other words, you know, feminism as a struggle which is across countries. But for me, Tina, transnational feminism, you know, very similar to what Abigail and Amina have said, it represents the political and conceptual struggle by feminists to contend with globalization processes, you know, and this transcends national boundaries, immigrations, race, class, sexualities, and the legacies of imperialism. Thank you.
The way I see it, I think I would like to look at what transnational feminisms or global feminisms have been able to achieve so far, and the work that's still unfinished. And that's, I believe, the reason why we're supposed to be having these conversations today. I think the most critical thing, as far as I know, is that with the global feminist agenda has come the understanding that women around the world, through different expressions and different contexts, are able to have conversations around deconstructing patriarchy and all the political, economic, social, cultural, and technological systems that make it possible for patriarchy to continue to thrive. And even when we do make some gains or inroads, there's always a backlash that keeps pushing us back to where we started, and keep having to up the ante or continue the conversations in different ways. But the fact that we have that understanding around the need for us to have the language and the tools to deconstruct patriarchy is a gain, a conceptual gain, and in many ways a practical one that I think we should be very pleased about. Secondly, an understanding of global feminism provides for all women around the world, regardless of whether they are in London, Puerto Rico, Congo, or Japan. It provides for all women around the world a sense of a global citizenship. As women, we are entitled to certain things as women, and the fundamental thing is to be seen as persons, for our personhood to be acknowledged, for us to be able to live our lives free from fear, free from violence, having the right to speak above a whisper should we want to, or speak in whispers should we need to. But an acceptance that as global citizens of the world, we have that right as women to a personhood. And another thing that global feminism has enabled us to do, it has provided leadership opportunities in critical areas, and I can name at least three. First of all, in the area of feminist scholarship and the body of knowledge and thought. 20 to 30 years ago, those who were deemed to have the knowledge and the authority to speak about African women, for example, were the European or white American women based in institutions where they had access to certain resources. And the women from the African continent were seen as the practitioners and not necessarily the scholars and the shapers of knowledge. Now, that has changed over the years, but the fact that that has changed with the likes of my sister, Professor Amina Mama around, Sylvia, and another mentor of mine I'd like to acknowledge you here in the audience, Professor Ronke Oyewumi, and many others out there, that has changed. So that's one of the significant gains I believe we've made. Another is having a whole lot of feminists as public advocates. We don't have enough of them yet because we don't need them to occupy those spaces just to make up the numbers. We need them to occupy those spaces to be able to change the paradigms and to be able to transform those systems. But we do have quite a number of feminists as public advocates in shaping public policy and trying to ensure that there is a better deal when it comes to talking about these rights in, used with caution, as Amina advises us to. And on a third level, we've witnessed a very significant number of women's movements, particularly located in the global south, led by women with agendas that are shaped by them. Unfortunately, the agency of these movements is not acknowledged by those who have access to the resources that they need to be able to get the work done, because there's an assumption that the agendas and the resources have to come from a particular part of the world, and that is where the knowledge resides. And then the implementation can be done by other people working to the agenda as set by people based in the global north, and it can't work that way, which leads me to what I describe as the unfinished business. Whether we are talking about global feminism or the rights of women or ending patriarchy, it's unfinished business. And if we really want to speak to the issues around women's resilience and women's power, we need to be able to have the humility to understand how women across the world, especially in places like the African continent, have defined power for themselves, have interrogated givens such as, for example, feminism began in the United States or in Europe, which is a profound insult to not only African women of this generation and the ones before, but even to our feminist ancestors who have always resisted patriarchy and who have always created spaces for themselves to speak above a whisper.
Each one of you in different ways has spoken to the frame behind which this panel was organized, which was this moment of stock-taking, right? A moment of stock-taking that each one of you can speak to in a really specific way based on your long-time activist practices, right? Each of you have been doing this for a long time. So when you talk, Abigail, about the stampede of money, right? When you speak, Amina, about neoliberalism and what kind of paradigm that's brought us to. When you speak, Bisi, about the unfinished business of a project that is ongoing, right? Each of you are talking about a transformation, a shift in the struggle that you began a long time ago, but are still working for. What does transnational feminism offer you in terms of strategies for engaging the conflicts that you're describing? You're describing a conflict between those who are not given resources, even when there's a rush of resources into that region, right? You're talking about, Amina, about transformation, how we need to reconceptualize our concepts and our categories from the beginning. What strategies do you use to be able to affect those kinds of changes and those kinds of transformations?
I'm not sure that we're all speaking exactly the same language, and I know that we all do very different things. Yes. My role is really in teaching, and that is something you do across borders, but only in certain areas. I find myself teaching about globalization. Now that I'm here, I find myself teaching methodologies and pedagogies. These are things that have different content in different locations, so they're process things. I don't find the content the same. What needs to be taught, what needs to be activated in people's minds is different in different locations. But I would say that one of the advantages of the university is not that it is indeed a fair and equitable global institution, but that you do knowledge work wherever you go. And in that respect, if the conventional mission of universities is to reproduce class inequalities, they're doing very well. To teach within those and try and do the opposite is a pedagogic challenge, it's a methodology challenge. So I would say I work there. And then the other area is having worked with colleagues like Jane Bennett over here in the audience and a whole circuit of feminists in Africa, trying to running a journal that gives a space for African knowledges informed by feminism to be shared, firstly among Africans. Look, we're meeting here in New York. I want to say that 20 years ago when I began this work, we met one by one in London or New York, and the first thing we did was concentrate on building a continental network. So learning to speak to ourselves. You know, in a sense, we've got too much ground to cover here. But I think learning to talk to each other, because as we're talking about global inequalities and neoliberalism, we also need to seriously challenge women with resources and position. We've spent decades getting women into politics. What are they actually doing? They're not bringing enough other women in for a start. And even there, once they're in positions of power, I've done some work recently looking at the routes that allow women to get to power. Bisi can tell us a bit more about it perhaps, but delivering on feminist agendas is not something that women politicians do, with few exceptions. And I would say those most feminist politicians in Africa have often been driven out of office. Margaret Donga, I was speaking to her in Zimbabwe last week, her house was burnt down for defending sex workers in Zimbabwe. And I could run through the list. We get women in. It's very hard for them to pursue our agendas. So it's not enough to just get women in. This is old Beijing. Now what do? We have a few women presidents. What do we do to actually activate them on behalf of gender justice agendas? And we're not talking just rights. I'm using the word justice specifically because rights, for all the critique I've made. So let me just say that I think everyone does what they can in their terrain. My terrain is research, knowledge work, and working with women's movements on organizational development and relational practices where possible.
I think before I talk about strategies, allow me, Tina, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to say this without sounding like a broken record, without sounding like a stereotypical angry African woman. But if we are going to talk about successful transnational feminisms, I think we need to put political correctness out of the window, because I think, we're not reinventing the wheel. We have had discussions about transnational feminism over and over. But I think what has been missing are those very important issues, some basics. I want us to go back to basics. Some basics that many of us talk about outside forums like this one. So I want to talk about, the fact that we operate between and out of different geopolitical spaces. I think it's extremely important that we are sensitive to some of these issues. I'll give some practical examples to demonstrate what I mean. For example, when we meet to discuss global feminism, transnational feminisms, there are many assumptions that are made. And I think one of the strategies we need to adopt is listening. We need to theorize listening. I know, scholars of rhetoric and literary scholars do this, but I think we need to really begin listening in terms of empathetic listening beyond words, and really getting to the nuances and the politics, the complexities of what our sisters are talking about. The example I want to give is, I've been, attending many of these forums, feminist forums, for over 20 years. And when we are invited to places like this, there are so many assumptions that are made. The kinds of macroeconomic assumptions that are made. For example, it's assumed that women from out of Africa are coming here and they have credit cards. I don't have a credit card, and I'm not planning to get sucked into the credit trap. But these are assumptions, and when we are checking into hotels, they always ask for credit cards. Say, but everything is being paid for. It doesn't matter, it's our policy, and they roll their eyes. And so, for me, what is at stake here is our dignity, our self-worth. The assumption that, you will come and feed yourself. And that's fine, but tell me beforehand. Tell me beforehand that, you're coming, but you know that on this day, everything is on you. And I'll probably decline the invitation because I can't afford it. It's as simple as that. Because when I convert my Uganda shillings to dollars, even at McDonald's, so many of us, I want to be very frank and put everything on the table. Many of us professors from the continent end up not eating. Or, 2 years ago, I was invited to give one of the keynote addresses at the African Studies Association. And I was put up in this beautiful suite in one of the 5-star hotels, but there was no breakfast, lunch, or dinner. And I'm thinking, what's the point? And I think it's also assumptions like these that lead to what I would like to call sillies. There's so many sillies that are going on, stupid things about, in the name of global feminism. I don't know how many of you have heard of initiatives such as Knickers for Africa campaign, Undies, yes, bras. If we get African women knickers, then maybe rape will be reduced. Clitoraid project raising money for dubious adoptions of African women's clitorises, restore them, those ones that are chopped off. Oxfam's bras without borders, 1 million bra campaign, Nectar lingerie brings us, they had this campaign, bring us your grumpy bras for African women. We have organizations like Meet Women for Women International, whose mission is to help move women from the global south from poverty and self-sufficiency. You have AfriPads Foundation, it's a Dutch foundation that seeks to distribute washable sanitary pads for vulnerable girls in Uganda. Girls in Karamoja where they have no water and where it is culturally taboo to even, dry your knickers in public, let alone pads. I can go on and on. Inequalities in North-South research collaboration. What I'm saying, Madam Moderator, is I think if this symposium is to be different from all the other transnational symposia that we've had, let us talk about those things that we only whisper about amongst ourselves when we leave such fora. Thank you.
Thank you for saying that. It's really important because the reason for such sillies is that we, on my side of this, have convinced ourselves it's a way to be helpful that where we don't actually have to do anything that causes us any discomfort or pain or even inconvenience. So there's a way for our way to text ourselves out of this, and used panties are a way out of this, and all the rest of the ridiculous. It's a way of offering a salve to the conscience, because deep in one's heart, in the United States, even the most uneducated people know that the level of inequality it can't stand. It's not right. It's a way of helping people go to sleep at night, and we do it within this country as well. If you'd watched the way the response to Hurricane Katrina went, we treated New Orleans a lot like we treat Africa. Used clothes and boxes of soap and no questions asked about why were the levees not maintained all that time to begin with. So what has to happen in this country, at least, I mean, I can only speak to what I really know, is for people to stop and say, well, how can I be of genuine help? If in fact that's what I want to do. What is it? How am I uniquely placed in this world? And, you know, Amina earlier used the M word, and I think it's a gigantic word. One of the primary reasons there's been a backlash against feminism and any analysis about sexual roles, including homosexuality, around the world, including in this, especially in this country, is actually militarism. And I know that sounds like a non sequitur, but it can't be underestimated what a driver of our economy it is, and what a driver of our ideology it is, and how right smack at the very, very center of it this country is. Not the center, the source. We have exported weapons around the world. We've exported a mythology of those weapons around the world in the form of the global entertainment industrial complex. And so if, in fact, we want to be... when I was first in Liberia and met President Sirleaf for the first time, I was there because I was interested in whether or not a woman at the top could, in fact, be transformative. And I saw that around her, very early in the process, were a series of American advisors. And the American advisors were there. The first best advisors and the best minds that she had around her were the people saying, here's how you rebuild your military. What on earth did Liberia need with a military? You know, you do not even dignify those warlords with the idea that they were soldiers or generals or armies representing any kind of agenda that wasn't essentially criminal. What she needed was a highly developed police force because she had a criminal problem. She didn't have a military problem. Why were we selling her the idea of a military smack out of the gate? Because it served us to do so. And it serves us to make sure that every country on the continent of Africa is spending significant percentages of their annual budgets on militaries. I mean, don't even start on what South Africa has spent on corrupt, poorly operating, not even functional equipment coming from the global north. So if we as Americans want to ask ourselves how to be of service, I think that there might be a turn inward that would be most beneficial. How do we contend with a culture that privileges aggression and violence and dominance as the only means of problem solving? I mean, I just watched Jon Stewart last night, and Lema encouraged us to bring Nadi to New York, so I'm just going to go ahead and say it. He actually said, well, our whole military policy is based on relative penis size anyway. We have a deep structural problem at the center of how we prepare for potential conflict, how we analyze potential conflict, how we as voters elect people to serve us in potential conflict. And unless we kind of completely reset our understanding of our role in the world and what we as potentially constructive force in it can mean with all of our resources, then we don't serve the world at all. So those of us here in this room, keep your bras in your panties and ask yourself what you can do in terms of changing the structures in this country around and the ideas and ideology around aggression, power dominance, and violence.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, for raising the issue of sillies. As someone who ran the African Women's Development Fund for 10 years, I can tell you a lot about silly when it comes to people's understanding of philanthropy. But I'll come back to that in a minute. I want to speak to two key concepts, because you were asking about strategies for the unfinished business. I want to talk about issues around voice and accountability. One of the reasons why we have so much silliness is because, as I said earlier, there are still some voices that are louder than others, and those voices are heard. We have African women who have worked in all these fields, in scholarship, in international development, in economic policy analysis for a long time. They lecture, they write papers, they travel the world, they work, they are very comfortable in so many different settings. But all it takes is for someone like Melinda Gates. I love Mrs. Gates, so this is just an example. All it takes is for someone like Melinda Gates to write an article about the needs of women in the global south, or how you need to change the lives of women through whatever initiative, and everyone sits up and they listen. All it takes is for someone like Hillary Clinton, again, we love her, to say something along the lines of, it takes a village to raise a child. Hello? And then it becomes global policy. Even if we don't remember anything else from our conversations today, it's very important for us to accept the fact, to be humble enough to accept the fact that there are women who know, and men as well from the African continent, who know what they are doing, who know what they are talking about, who have solutions. And we are not saying that these solutions can only be determined by African scholars, practitioners, or leaders themselves. No, that's where the transnational conversations come in. That's where global solidarity comes in. That's where partnerships come in. But the solutions do not reside in the hands of people who just pay one visit to the Gambia, interact with a group of villagers there, listen to whatever problems they have, and come back, and lo and behold, a non-profit is born. It doesn't work that way. So that's around voice. My second issue is around accountability. Now, if there's one thing we know that we have gained over the years as African women in terms of all our demands and activism and, as a result of raising our voices, is the whole issue of having access to certain spaces where policies are made, where decisions are made, and so on. We've changed political landscapes in some countries, like Liberia, for example. We have a woman president, two-time president for that matter. We have a woman president in Malawi. We have a significant number of women who hold non-traditional portfolios, ministers of finance, ministers of petroleum. I'm talking about my country, Nigeria, for example. So we have done a lot in that regard. But there has been very little accountability. We have a whole slew of international agreements, regional frameworks that we can quote. We know them off the top of our heads. And why do we know them? Because many of us here sat down to write those instruments, to draft those documents. Some of us are here attending the Commission on the Status of Women. I've been attending the Commission on the Status of Women for at least 18 to 19 years now. At the risk of sounding immodest, some of us here can write the outcomes document of many of these meetings even before the meeting starts. But the one thing that keeps a lot of us going is the understanding that we need to keep having these conversations because we need accountability. Lema spoke earlier on about some of the stories that don't get told. I'll share with you something that I'm sure you would not stumble across unless you Google it. My husband is the governor of Ekiti State, Nigeria, E-K-I-T-I, so you can Google that. He ran for governor of Ekiti State in 2007. we had the elections in April, something went wrong, we had to go to court. So it took 3.5 years for him to start his official mandate as governor. So he assumed office in October 2010, and we are up for election this June. Now, on March 8, 2007, International Women's Day, we put together a document which we called My Pact with Ekiti Women. I must confess, I was the one who drafted the document, because I had spent all my time going around other places, telling leaders what to do, insisting on accountability and so on. So I told my husband, you have to be accountable to the women of this state should you become the governor. So we drafted this document which indicated what it is my husband would do for the women of the state should he become the governor. Economic programs around women's rights, discriminatory practices, the like. So we put out this document on March 8, 2007. His term started October 2010, as I said. So now that we are up for re-election, on Saturday, March 8, 2014, my husband stood before 5,000 women in the state who were brought together to celebrate International Women's Day, to give account of how he had used their mandate in the first 4 years. And I was very proud that all the things he said he would do, of course with the help of a whole lot of people around who felt it was important, including yours truly, who wouldn't allow him to have a good night's rest if it wasn't done. All the things that we promised the women of the state have been done and actually have been exceeded. We now have legislation in the state that protects women and girls from violence. We have a gender-based violence prohibition law, which I helped champion. We have an equal opportunities law. The state is the only state in Nigeria that domesticated the national gender policy, and I could go on and on. But I'm just giving you this as an example of what we mean by accountability and what it is we expect of those who are people have entrusted, male or female, with their votes, because it's still part of the unfinished business of social justice movements across the continent.
So I anticipated the fact that it's going to be hard to make this into a relatively compact conversation. But I want to ask everyone, folks in the audience, to join us in this conversation. So if you have questions, take about 15, 20 minutes, maybe 3 or 4 questions or 5.
Well, first of all, thank you. As a feminist based in Mexico here for the CSW, that was very inspiring. I have many questions, but I think what you said about voices is very interesting. And in that sense, I also have a question about spaces and how to occupy different spaces. Because from what I've observed, as a feminist movement, we are occupying spaces that have been constructed for women's rights. And if our argument is that women's rights are human rights, then why are we not occupying other types of spaces, especially in regards to militarism and security issues? And then my other question is, I'm very interested in the gender justice argument versus the human rights framework, although obviously they're very related, because I feel as if we do not have a human rights-based language, then what we are fighting for can become very subjective. Agreed? But I feel like the gender justice aspect is very interesting because it can bring in accountability in a way that human rights language maybe does not.
All of you work in different areas and different arenas, and I wanted to really ask how you negotiate the privilege and the power that you've gained in making sure that you stay rooted in the women who are not present at the center, right? The women whose work and whose voices you're trying to bring into the spaces that you occupy. How do you negotiate while you rise up the ranks and gain more privilege and power? How do you keep yourself grounded in? And what type of words would you offer for those of us moving through our careers that want to bring these women into these spaces and these opinions, but need an understanding of how that works?
This may sound naive, so please forgive me. In Brooklyn, and it's elsewhere, there have been Black nationalists and African type of folks who promote a certain, what they promote to us, descendants of chattel slaves, a certain kind of Africanness and African cultural paradigms and ideologies, as if it's the only way to be Black and love the motherland. And when they do that, there was one who died last year who for 50 years was promoting what I call ghetto polygamy. Literally, right before he died, he was like, he didn't understand why women, you know, we didn't want that. Meanwhile, he didn't see how it permutated into 8, 9, 10, and 11, 12-year-old girls becoming mothers, and then nobody, you know, cared. There was no accountability. There is no accountability now at all with the family structure. They even, earlier this year, there was a flyer about some Garveyite type of group that had right on the front that, you know, telling Black women that feminism, there's something wrong with feminism, that we need to reject feminism because it's not African. So I just want to wind up to say, can you help me, because I'm really not stupid, but can you help me try to unpack it and translate it where I am, so that it's to the point where, you know, there are people that say, well, yes, we need to embrace the motherland. We're all from the motherland, and we want to do that. But nobody says, even the male-identified women, nobody says that culture mutates. That the things that they're saying that are cultural paradigms had to come from somewhere, and they didn't necessarily start from the beginning of time. You know, we're told all kind of crazy stuff, like, you know, they'll talk about the Egyptian pyramids, but they won't talk about the reproductive devices that were found in those Asian pyramids too, and then they say that we're not African because we use birth control. You know, thanks a lot.
Thanks.
I am the daughter of 2 Nigerian immigrants who came in the late 70s. I am interested in knowing, as people of my generation, people who were born in the 80s and 90s across the diaspora, as we come of age, how we can make use of our situations as people with feet in both worlds. So as an American and also as a Nigerian by citizenship, how to connect in meaningful ways with what's being said. And I just want to put this out there so that you know that we're here, that we're present. And my second question has to do with what Professor Bisi has been saying about speaking for others. I'm interested and very curious about voices like, probably everyone knows, very familiar with Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times. I feel like there are some ways in which voices like, yes, I'm sure, okay. Okay, we can use initials or just, but you know, I feel like there are some ways in which some of these voices are useful. It's true that, just like Professor Bisi says, some voices resonate more with broader groups of people than others. And the reason for this, it's not fair, but it's just the way things sometimes work. How do we make use of voices that sometimes might, even if just in the meantime, advance the agenda, allow people to familiarize themselves with the issues without getting absorbed by them, like indefinitely?
How do you fundraise without contributing to the oppressive economic power structure? And this is directed to you, Ms. Disney, because you talk about the financial necessities, but also to you, Professor Mama, because in one of your papers you talk about how capitalism undermines feminism. So what are your thoughts on this?
This framework of women's rights as human rights, it's got its advantages. Working within this framework has a lot of value, you know, universalizing inequalities across and within nations. It gives legitimacy to women's political demands because governments recognize and understand the rights language as an instrument. And the rights framework allows us to focus on women as being entitled to rights as opposed to being instrumentalized as, for instance, educate women to reduce child mortality. But without any doubt, the framework of human rights has limitations, and that approach needs to be rehabilitated. And I think in an era of neoliberal globalization, the women's rights as human rights approach has limitations in that it has a tendency to depoliticize women's movements. Its action downplays or altogether ignores the material dimensions of collective women's action. And it also masks the structured gendered power embedded in resources, resource production and distribution. So this approach assumes that power flows from rights, but in reality, from experience, we know that rights flow from power. Indeed, liberal rights discourses, it does very little in addressing the inequalities in resources and power. And what it does, polarizes in polarized societies along gender lines. So the rights-based approach, in my view, amounts to legalized politics. And it views women as abstract, faceless mannequins with no status distinctions. So, for example, when you look at the MDGs, they're based on neoliberally defined idea of poverty, which attempts to solve social problems with economic solutions. So, this rights-based approach cannot provide the conditions for eradicating many forms of gender oppression, for example, global economic processes and racism. So feminists have been talking about suggesting using alternative frameworks, for example, economic and social justice instead of, or in addition to, the human rights framework.
Yeah, I think shifting the discourse from rights to justice is a step. I hear that a lot in the United States. I'm not sure that, because justice is also kind of a legal concept, and I'm looking at Sylvia as a lawyer. What is justiciable? I think what matters is what we mean. So the discourse shifts all the time, but at the root, and here we're agreeing very tightly, are the systemic, long-term systemic things that mean no matter how much rights work you do, the lack of rights will continue to be enacted through the existing political and economic and other systems, even the judicial system. So I think the limits of, I think in 1993 when the Vienna Tribunal came up with women's rights are human rights, look, it's a bit like civil rights. We're human too. It's a minimalist agenda. I go back to that. It's necessary, but it's embarrassing that in the 21st century we're still having to even talk about it. And that suggests that all the decades of work on rights has missed the mark in some ways. So while we have to keep doing it, because it does yield some protections for some women, we shouldn't lose sight of the systemic picture in which very few women have access to lawyers. So the economy comes immediately back in. So the problem with the rights discourse is it depoliticizes and it removes political economy and pursues, individualism, which is entirely, as I said earlier, compatible with neoliberalism. But the nationalism, I do want to respect our sister from Brooklyn and hear you and say I sympathize, and it's not only in Brooklyn. I don't know Brooklyn, but I can tell you that men in power across the African continent have utilized nationalist, pseudo-nationalist discourses that erase women's history. In fact, we speak of two languages. No, it happens on the continent too. And the endless discourse about what is acceptable for women. You're seeing it now in its current reiteration on the LGBTQI questions. irrelevant to the mass poverty of most Africans, irrelevant to the insecurities that people are living under. But that is what is trumpeted from those who are in power in the name of defending African tradition. This is not our tradition. The whole discourse, instead of focusing on regional integration, is focusing on how to ostracize minority elements within the populations and actually unleash civil society on them. So that's an iteration of patriarchal interpretations of nationalism. It's used to justify child marriage, to excuse and justify, and to remove the accountability that we're talking about here. So this is rubbish. You know what, men invent tradition as it suits them. Well, women and feminists have done a lot of work redefining African cultures as fluid, as dynamic, and above all, as sites of endless contestation. So I want to sort of knock that one on the head. That discourse is going on very much within the region. But then we have white saviors bussing in. Sorry, the Christoph book, I'm so upset about it because it was picked as my campus's book of the year. And, you know, we objected to talking now about our own power. I'm no longer the director, but I work on the Women's Studies program at Davis. And this book, we opposed it, that this is an insult to women of color globally. We do not need a white savior to come and save us. It is important that he talks to his people, but for us, from our positions, it's an insult. Okay, that liberal well-intentionedness, it pisses us off, frankly. Can we be naughty? It pisses us off. Okay, we're tired of it. So, but the real point is that we need to shift whose voices are heard. It is true, and I agree. I can understand the opportunism of the strategy that says, you know, some women have big voices, and some women have some power. But if that isn't, you know, leveraged into a dispersal of power, into actually allowing more people to have those voices, then it's not democratic power. And I very much appreciate, Ekiti State, by the way, is as big as many countries. It's a huge area. I very much appreciate the experiments that are being done. But I want to give another example of transnational feminism from the region. You spoke of writing a charter of women's rights, what women need in Ekiti, and that's a very nice personalized strategy, taking advantage of the power that you and your husband enjoy. Another example, because these are all different kinds of strategies, is the one of the Women's Manifestos movements across Africa. A number of countries have had processes, and this is why I come back to process all the time. The terms of engagement, the processes, have had processes to articulate women's manifestos. And there are two ways of doing it. A group of smart, capacitated women could sit and draft something. In fact, the particular organization I'm thinking of was offered funding to do just that. Luckily, they've been around a long time. They refused. What was important about the production of the Ghanaian Women's Manifesto was that they insisted on taking many months and going across the entire country and consulting with women. So you had basically a democratic platform. But it wasn't just the document, it was that process of saying, what are your agendas? What are your issues? What do you want to be taken to national level? So if we don't have those are democratization processes. If we don't have those, and we can't rely on the new elites, even the old elites, because frankly, they've run the world for a long time and it hasn't delivered. So if we talk about accountability, we have to talk about breaking that down and looking again, and using whatever methods we have. There are numerous strategies. Personally, I'm finding it increasingly hard, talking of opportunity structures. I moved to the US Academy lately, and I spent 10 years trying to raise funds for a project to train grassroots groups in post-conflict countries to do evidence-based advocacy. There's no funding for it, it's canceled. But we worked with groups in 4 countries, trained them up. So that's a personal frustration. So I want to say that the more successful you get, you have, of course, many opportunities. But in terms of doing what some of us consider real work, the opportunity structure I now inhabit, I don't know how long for, but as an academic who's now come into the US Academy, is making it intractable. It's making it extremely hard to do the kinds of work that I see from a global analysis need to be happening at different locations. So I say I teach, I do research. We do what we can.
Well, I'd like to address the question that was asked at the back there about voice and space for feminist engagement. And I'd like to link back to the question from this side. I think the question was directed at Abi, but I'd like to respond to it as well, about how you raise money without falling into the same silliness that Sylvia was talking about. A very brief anecdote on how the African Women's Development Fund started. When I was trying to raise money for the African Women's Leadership Institute when I was in Amway in the UK, I sent a proposal to a Dutch donor. This was sometime between 1996 and 1997. This Dutch donor held on to a proposal for almost a year. And then a reply came back saying no. Now, as a professional fundraiser at the time, I didn't have any problem with the no. Because if you're trying to raise money, 7 to 8 times out of 10, you will get a no. It was why they were saying no that really, in the spirit of naughtiness, that really pissed me off. These folks had the audacity to write back to us and say they couldn't fund the African Women's Leadership Institute because it was all about African women getting together to talk about power and leadership. And those are not the things that African women need. African women need food, they need shelter, they need water, they need whatnot. We were pissed. And that is how the African Women's Development Fund started. Because we wanted to be able to not just help amplify the voices of women, not our voices now. When we are working as part of a movement, there is an assumption that we have to work from, that we are an integral part of that movement. Some of us just happen to be fortunate enough to be drivers. But we are not speaking on behalf of anybody. We are speaking with our communities. So not only was it important for us to help amplify the voices of women in our communities, we also had to help them keep their spaces as well, because it is within these spaces, however they define them, as NGOs, as associations, networks, and so on, that's where they get to define their priorities. And that is where the African Women's Development Fund was able to, that was how they were able to support women to address their own leadership issues in their own communities. And one of those things that we did fund, one of the processes we did support, was the women's manifestos, both in Ghana and Nigeria, because those processes were very important mobilization tools. And now, after having come from all those experiences, finding myself in a place where I had to now start putting into practice the things I've been doing in other places, it was a no-brainer for me for us to start looking at those ways in which we could make ourselves continue to be accountable to the people. So it's not, we don't have the luxury of saying we are working with some people out there, we are the ones up there. I don't think that's a responsible or even logical way of approaching social justice activism or feminist activism. And I think going forward, one of the things we need to really work on is how we reframe the narrative, particularly the narrative that's coming out of the African continent around who defines the agenda, who has the resources to control the agenda, and who we have in place to be able to hold accountable to do things differently, so that we can continue to have discussions that are nuanced instead of a lot of the silliness that has been happening.
Just to go back to the privilege question, which I think is not irrelevant to this room. I think of myself as I am to America, what America is to the world. So I happen to have a name that causes people to presume a lot of things about me, and privilege, and you know, and it's all true. I have a lot of privilege that I didn't ask for and especially didn't earn. And, you know, it has created in me so much conflict and complication because I haven't got a chance to go back and be reborn as anything but what I am. And so, yes, I am a quasi-victim and also beneficiary of circumstance. And the question is not, how do I make myself fit into a more appealing package, but how do I make this life useful to the best and highest purpose that I possibly can? And what I've had to accept is that hypocrisy is going to be, to a certain extent, an occupational hazard for me. I don't know quite how to extricate myself entirely from a system which I know with its right hand benefits me and with its left hand destroys and terrorizes billions of people around the world. I don't know quite how to be useful to the best and highest purpose without also being somewhat guilty of benefiting by a system that hurts. And so Sylvia raised the question of listening. And I have to say that my life sort of began in its contemporary form when I started working with the New York Women's Foundation, and I started going out and hearing from the grantees there, because they understood listening as an action, as a thing you were really doing, not a passive thing, but a radical act. And it was when I opened myself to that listening that I began to understand that I might have a purpose. And it was working with those women here in New York City, very low-income women who had stepped forward and identified themselves as viable political actors who could really address problems in their communities. It was those women who made my eyes ready to be in Liberia and to hear a story, and this is going to sound self-congratulatory, and I don't mean to be this way at all, but you know, hundreds of journalists had trooped through Liberia before me, and not one of them either believed or credited the story that I heard there. And I believe the difference is that my eyes were made ready because of taking listening to be a radical act. And what became clear to me there was that I would be one of those bridge people. And I've come to understand that the history moves forward in part because of enormous forces, bigger than any of us, but it's nuanced by people who act irrationally. It's the people who do the unexpected things, the people who don't fit into Adam Smith's idea of just everybody acts in rational ways. We need traitors to people, to your class. You have to be a traitor to your class, whether that class is a class of color or sexuality or gender or whatever. And when you act with all your heart as a traitor to your class, then you mix everything up, you do something unexpected, you throw a wild card into things, and then who knows what might come of it. I had no idea what would come of crediting that story, but I knew that I stood on a cusp of worlds, and I had the capacity to listen in a way that others hadn't before me, and I had a capacity to speak to people who needed to hear and who might be altered by what they heard. And all through our editing process, and it was a confusing and difficult film to make, but the war was complicated, and you know, how much to explain, how much not to explain. And what we realized was, if we just use as a guiding principle, what did the women know, and when did they know it, and how did they know it, and why did they know it? Just let them speak. And no narrator, and that's anybody who's edited film will know that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. It was an 8-month edit because we didn't use a narrator, because we understood the paucity of African female voices unmoderated through the well-intended Angelina Jolie or whatever. So my grandmother used to say to me that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I always said that was the most horrible Irish Catholic thing you could possibly say. What an awful thing. And I've come to agree with her. You know, I know Nick well, and I like him as a person. I love him as a person, and Cheryl, and I know that they're enormously well-intended. But that, with no accountability attached, is a disaster. And it has proven to be a disaster again and again and again and again. There needs to be a backwards glance built into all of our aid and all of our philanthropy and all of our systems. There is no backwards glance in it. We don't read the histories of ourselves. We don't understand our own mistakes. We don't talk about our mistakes. And we need to build listening as a radical and transformative act into everything that we do.
I am terribly sorry, but we're 15 minutes into the next panel. So I'm going to have to ask you to continue this conversation over a brief break. Oh, I promise. Oh, one gender. Okay, please go ahead.
No, for a moment I thought you were trying to disregard the brother. Anyway, do you see where the movement is going? Greetings, ladies, and the brothers too. And a very progressive Women's History Month to you. My name is Jose Richards, and I'm a victim of the African Holocaust. So my question to you is, how do you women expect to ever free yourselves if the men are not free? You know, in my humble opinion, we think sometimes that because men carry titles as president and prime ministers and minister of finance and all those things, that they are free. And Mr. Garvey once said that others may free our bodies, but none but ourselves can free our minds. And if we as a people at this stage in our development or underdevelopment, it hasn't dawned on us that our problems can only be solved by us. If we don't come together as an African race of people, sit down, identify the problems we have, and bring everybody along. Women cannot free themselves by themselves. The men have to be freed also because they are just as enslaved as the women are. And so I am hoping that out of this conference, we can have some serious discussion as to what is our people, and we get together and we work it out because nobody else is going to do it but us.
Sorry, the next panel is actually talking about the men question, so maybe their question could just be rolled over there. But I, for one, did say that most African men are also not free. So I just want to say this question can be pursued at length in the next panel.
And the problem is that they just don't know.
Can we hear from the other young man before
Thank
we
you.
break?
I think this is a great moment to actually to begin to transition into the next panel. So I'm going to ask that we have really a 5-minute break. Before that, I want to ask you to recognize what we have had in this conversation and to thank our guests.